The sun had just started sinking behind the red cliffs, spilling orange light over the dry land. The wind rolled low across the open plains, whispering through the tall grass and pushing thin clouds of dust ahead of it. Eli Turner rode slowly along the trail that cut between the hills and the river, his hat pulled low to block the glare. He had been out since dawn checking the fences of his ranch and bringing back a stray calf that had wandered too far. His horse, a tall brown mare named June, moved steady beneath him, hooves thudding softly against the hard ground. Eli was a man who spoke little and worked much. Folks in town called him quiet but fair, a man who would rather fix a problem than talk about it. He lived alone on his spread since his father had passed, spending his days mending rails, tending cattle, and watching the seasons change over the desert hills. To most people he looked calm, maybe distant, but inside him ran the steady patience of a man who had known both loss and duty. As the trail curved near a broken wagon lying at the edge of the ridge, Eli slowed his horse. The wagon's wheels were half buried in the sand. One axle snapped clean through. The canvas cover flapped weakly in the wind. Beside it stood a woman. She was barefoot, her long skirt torn near the hem, her hands clutching a thin shawl around her shoulders. Her hair, once neatly braided, had come loose in wild strands that blew across her face. She looked as if she had been waiting there a long time. Too long. Eli guided his horse closer and spoke gently, careful not to startle her. "You lost, ma'am?" His voice carried the steady calm of a man used to speaking to frightened animals. The woman turned toward him. Her eyes were large and tired, the color of a storm cloud. She didn't answer right away, as if she was not sure he was real. Finally, she nodded a little, her lips trembling. "They left me," she said, her voice thin as the wind. "They took my brothers and said they'd be back. But they never came." Eli looked around. The road stretched empty in both directions. No wagon tracks fresh enough to follow. No smoke from a distant camp. Only the open desert and the lonely sound of the wind. "Who took them?" he asked softly. "3 men," she whispered. "They said they'd guide us through the ridge to reach the western pass. My brothers trusted them, but when the storm came, they said I slowed them down. They locked me here, said they'd return." Her words faltered, swallowed by silence. Eli swung down from his saddle. He pulled a canteen from his saddlebag and handed it to her. She hesitated, then took it with shaking hands. She drank carefully, as if afraid it might vanish. When she finished, she handed it back with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she murmured. Eli studied her face. Beneath the dirt and weariness, there was a fragile kind of grace. She looked young, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had been older for a long time. "You hurt?" he asked. She shook her head quickly, though the small wince that crossed her face said otherwise. She pulled her shawl tighter around herself. Her hands trembled as she did, and that's when he saw the glint of iron on her wrists. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but then he saw clearly. The faint metal cuffs biting into her skin, small rings connected by a thin chain. The marks around her wrists were dark and raw, evidence of days spent trapped. "Please, take them off," she said suddenly, her voice breaking. Eli froze. He had seen many things on the frontier. Cattle thieves, lost travelers, men fighting over land, but never a woman bound like this, alone in the wild. He felt anger rise, sharp and cold. No words came to him for a moment. He only looked at her wrists, then into her eyes. She didn't flinch away. She only waited, silent, desperate. He moved slowly so she would not be afraid. From his belt he drew a small knife, the same one he used for cutting rope and leather straps. The blade caught the last light of the sun. She stepped back a little, fear flickering across her face. "It's all right," he said quietly. "I'll be careful." She nodded once, trusting him because she had nothing else left to trust. Eli took her wrists gently, turning the cuffs to find the weak point. The chain was thin but the metal strong. He pressed the edge of his knife into the joint and began to work, patient and steady. The wind whistled softly between them. Her breathing quickened as the blade scraped metal, sparks flashing in the fading light. "Almost," he murmured. After a tense minute, one cuff gave a sharp click. It loosened, then fell to the ground. The second followed soon after. The small chain dropped with a soft thud against the sand. She stared down at her wrists, free at last. Her fingers trembled as she touched the skin, half in disbelief. Then she looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "I didn't think anyone would come," she whispered. Eli slipped the knife back into its sheath and straightened. "You're safe now," he said. At least for tonight. The wind tugged gently at her shawl. She looked toward the dark hills where the men who had abandoned her might still be. They won't stop, she said softly. They'll keep riding west. My brothers. They're still with them. Eli's jaw tightened. He looked down the long stretch of empty land. Somewhere out there were 3 men who thought they could chain a woman and walk away free. He didn't like the thought of that. Do you know their names? He asked. One was called Marvin. The others I never heard clear, she replied. They spoke rough and laughed a lot. Eli nodded slowly. He had heard of a man named Marvin before, a hired trail guide with a temper and a habit of leaving people worse than he found them. He turned back to her. You got a name? Clara, she said quietly. Clara Miles. Well, Clara Miles, he said, you can ride with me till we reach town. We'll get you fed and rested. After that, we'll see what can be done about those men. She hesitated, then nodded. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, though her eyes still glistened. Eli helped her onto his horse. June shifted slightly but stood calm as Clara climbed behind the saddle, holding on loosely. The warmth of the horse and the steady rhythm of its steps seemed to pull the fear out of her bones. They rode under a sky that was slowly filling with stars. The road ahead glowed pale in the moonlight, a silver path through the emptiness. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful, even kind. After a time, Clara said softly, You didn't have to stop for me. Eli looked ahead. Maybe not, he said. But I was raised to never ride past someone in trouble. She lowered her head, smiling faintly. Most men would have. Then most men forgot what it means to be a man, he replied. The stars brightened, stretching endless above them. A coyote's distant call echoed from the ridge. The desert night smelled of sage and dust. After several miles, Eli stopped near a low rise where the ground dipped toward the river. He dismounted and helped Clara down. We'll camp here, he said. It's safe and there's water, she nodded. While he gathered wood, she knelt by the riverbank, washing the dirt from her hands and face. When she touched the cool water, she almost cried again. It had been days since she'd felt clean air, open sky, and the freedom to move her own hands. Eli returned with kindling and built a small fire. The flame flickered, painting his weathered face in gold light. He offered her a piece of dried meat and some bread from his saddlebag. She ate slowly, thankful for every bite. Where were you headed? He asked when she was done. West, she said. My brothers and I were hoping to find work near the coast. We lost our farm in a storm last spring. The river rose too high. We had nothing left to stay for. Eli nodded. He knew that story too well. Too many families pushed from their land, chasing a dream through dust and danger. Then we'll get you there, he said quietly. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Clara looked at him, her eyes soft. Why are you helping me? He poked the fire with a stick. Because someone ought to. The flames danced higher and the night grew colder. Clara wrapped the blanket he gave her around her shoulders and lay near the fire. For the first time in days, she felt safe enough to close her eyes. Eli sat awake a little longer, watching the horizon. The stars above shimmered like distant campfires, and the land stretched quiet and endless. He knew he'd ride into danger soon. Men like those she described didn't stop until someone made them, but he didn't mind. Something in Clara's trembling voice had stirred the part of him that still believed decency meant action. When the fire finally burned low, he leaned back against his saddle and let his eyes close. June grazed nearby, and Clara slept peacefully beside the embers. Out there on the edge of the world, beneath a wide and watchful sky, 2 strangers found a fragile kind of calm. And though neither said it aloud, both understood that tomorrow would bring hard choices, the kind that could change a life forever. The morning came soft and golden. A thin mist hung over the river, curling between the rocks and the tall grass. Eli was already awake, feeding his horse and packing the small camp. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the creak of leather, the crackle of the dying fire, and the faint rustle of water moving over stones. Clara stirred slowly from her blanket, rubbing her eyes. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. Then she saw the fire, the horse, and Eli moving quietly nearby. The fear that had lived in her chest for days started to fade. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe enough to breathe without trembling. Eli looked over and gave a small nod. Morning, he said. She smiled faintly. Morning. Her voice was still soft from sleep. He poured her a little water from the canteen and handed her a piece of bread. "Eat up," he said. "We've got a long ride." She sat near the river, watching the sunlight turn the water gold. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Town first," Eli replied. "There's a sheriff there. He can help find your brothers, maybe send word west if they made it that far." Clara nodded, though worry clouded her eyes again. "If they're alive," she whispered. Eli stopped packing for a moment and looked at her. "We'll hope they are," he said gently. "Sometimes hope's all a person has out here." They set off soon after, riding side by side along the dusty road. The land stretched wide and empty around them, filled with the cries of distant hawks and the sound of the wind pushing through the grass. Every few miles they passed an old fence or a rusted wagon wheel, quiet reminders of those who had come before and never made it far. Eli kept a steady pace, glancing back now and then to make sure she was doing all right. Clara held tight to the saddle, her strength slowly returning. She had never ridden so far before, but she refused to complain. The world felt bigger than it ever had, and somehow, even with her worries, she felt a strange kind of peace in it. As they rode, she told him little things, about her brothers, about the small farm they'd lost, about the way her mother used to hum while kneading bread on Sundays. Eli listened quietly, saying little, but he remembered every word. The way she spoke reminded him of things he had once cared for, too, small things that made a life worth holding on to. When the sun rose high, they stopped by a patch of cottonwood trees. Eli let the horse drink from a small stream, while Clara rested in the shade. He filled 2 cups with water and sat beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke. After a time, she looked at him. "Why do you live out here all alone?" she asked. He shrugged, picking up a small stone and turning it in his hand. "Guess it's quieter this way. Folks come and go. Land stays. You ever wish you weren't alone?" she asked softly. Eli didn't answer right away. He looked toward the horizon, where the hills shimmered in the heat. "Sometimes," he said at last, "but it's easier to miss what you lost than to lose something again." Clara nodded, understanding more than he expected. "I think I know what you mean." They rode again in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As afternoon turned to evening, the town came into view. A small cluster of wooden buildings gathered near the old rail line. Smoke drifted from chimneys and a few wagons stood outside the livery. It wasn't much, but after the long, empty ride, it looked almost like a promise. When they reached the main street, Eli dismounted first and helped Clara down. Her legs were weak and she nearly stumbled, but he caught her arm before she fell. "Easy," he said. "You're safe here." She smiled faintly, grateful. Together they walked toward the sheriff's office, a weathered building with a sign half faded by the sun. Inside, the sheriff sat behind a desk, reading a stack of papers. He was a big man with gray hair and a kind face. When he looked up and saw Eli, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Eli Turner, as I live and breathe." "You bringing me trouble again?" Eli gave a small shrug. "Not this time, Tom. Found someone out on the ridge. Thought you ought to hear her story." The sheriff's smile faded when he saw Clara. "Ma'am, you all right?" She nodded slowly, her voice trembling. "I was left behind. They said they'd come back for me, but they never did." Eli stepped forward. "She was chained to a wagon, Tom, 3 men. One of them goes by Marvin. You know the name?" The sheriff's eyes hardened. "I know it," he said quietly. "He's been running wild since spring, guiding travelers, robbing them, leaving them for dead. We've been looking to catch him for weeks." Clara clasped her hands. "My brothers. They're with him." Tom stood, pulling his hat from the rack. "Then we'll find them." He called out to 2 deputies in the back. "Get the horses ready. We're heading for the ridge." Eli turned to Clara. "You stay here. You'll be safe." She looked up at him, worry in her eyes. "You're going with them, aren't you?" He gave a small nod. "They won't be far. I'll bring your brothers back if I can." Clara wanted to protest, but something in his calm, steady voice made her stop. She simply said, "Please be careful." Eli tipped his hat. "Always am." By nightfall, Eli and the sheriff's men were riding hard toward the mountains. The wind howled through the canyons, carrying the smell of rain. They found tracks near the ridge, wagon wheels and hoofprints heading west. The trail led to an old mining camp half buried in sand. When they reached it, they found the missing wagon and 2 frightened young men huddled near the fire, Clara's brothers. They were weak but alive. The 3 outlaws who had taken them were nowhere in sight. They had fled only hours before. The sheriff's men followed the trail through the dark until the first light of dawn broke over the cliffs. By morning, they had the men in irons. There was no fight, just a long, quiet surrender. When they rode back into town 2 days later, Clara was waiting on the porch of the sheriff's office. The moment she saw her brothers, she ran to them. Tears fell freely down her cheeks as she held them both close. Eli watched from a few steps away, his hat in his hand. The sight brought a rare warmth to his chest, the kind that only comes from knowing a thing was made right again. Clara turned to him, her eyes shining. "You kept your promise," she said softly. He smiled just a little. "Told you I would." Her brothers thanked him again and again, but Eli just shook his head. "Just glad you're all safe." When the sheriff stepped out to take the outlaws inside, Clara walked closer. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "Don't need to," Eli replied. "Seeing you freeze thanks enough." She looked at him for a long moment, the words she wanted to say caught in her throat. "Where will you go now?" she asked finally. "Home," he said simply. "Got fences to mend and cattle to count. Will I ever see you again?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, then at the open plains stretching far beyond the town. "Hard to say," he answered. "But out here, paths cross when they're meant to." Clara smiled sadly, though her eyes held a kind of peace. "Then I hope our paths cross again." Eli nodded once, a quiet promise. "So do I." He tipped his hat to her and mounted his horse. The morning sun was rising behind the hills, turning the sky pale gold. He looked back one last time, at the woman he had found by chance and freed without asking anything in return, then turned his horse toward the horizon. Clara stood there long after he was gone, watching until he became no more than a small figure moving against the light. She didn't know where life would take her next, but she knew she would remember him always. The quiet rancher who stopped when no one else would. The man who gave her back her freedom and her faith and kindness. And out on the open trail, Eli rode on through the dust and wind, the sound of hooves echoing across the valley. He didn't look back again, but somewhere deep inside, he carried the memory of her voice, the way she had looked at him when he broke those chains, and the simple truth that doing the right thing never needed a reason. As the day stretched ahead and the plains opened wide, he smiled faintly beneath the brim of his hat. The world was still rough, still unforgiving, but for a moment, it felt a little less lonely. The wind rose behind him, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of new beginnings, the kind that only the Wild West could give to those brave enough to keep riding.